Is it possible to betray yourself? To get so far off course that you don't even know who you are anymore or what you're even doing? Well, today we are talking Invisibility Blues. H.G. Wells, The Invisible Man, published in 1897. Fun fact, 1897 was also the year that Bram Stoker published Dracula. So, yeah, it was a good year for old literature. Let's get into it. So this lady, this English teacher, gave me a copy of The Invisible Man in Japanese, but this seems to be for children. I'm not sure why she gave it to me. Maybe she thought I would study Japanese with it, but it's got some nice illustrations. Although I think that this book, I don't know if kids should necessarily read this. It's kind of dark. It's kind of violent, but it's fun, I guess. So anyway, I was thinking about The Invisible Man, which I had not read since high school, and I decided to dig through the old Tsundoku vault, and I found this horrible, beaten copy where the cover itself is becoming invisible, published by Magnum Easy Eye Books. So the font is really big, which is nice. I'm getting older. I need something that's easy on the eyes. Put pleasure in your reading. Larger type makes the difference. This Easy Eye edition is set in large clear type, at least 30% larger than usual. Alright, that's enough of that. And I also happen to have this nice edition of H.G. Wells, 4 of H.G. Wells' novels. And this is actually from Barnes & Noble. Say what you will about Barnes & Noble, they make a nice package when they collect these old classic editions. Do people still hate Barnes & Noble? Do you hate Barnes & Noble? Anyway, I think this one's pretty good. So I actually cracked this one open and I read The Invisible Man. And the great thing about that story is you can read it in an afternoon. It's a short novel. So our main character is Griffin. He's an albino scientist who is obsessed with making some kind of scientific breakthrough. The thing that I like about Griffin is he is both Dr. Frankenstein and the monster. He makes the scientific discovery, and he applies it to himself. So that makes him quite unique amongst some of the classic characters. You almost think of like a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde kind of situation, where he's this sort of a egocentric but fairly mild-mannered scientist, maybe with a few dreams of world domination. And then he becomes invisible and he sort of starts unraveling and losing himself.
All right, you fools. You've brought it on yourselves. Everything would have come right if you'd only left me alone.
He's a rather disturbing anti-hero, but not without some comical elements. I would argue that this is the most fun of the old monster books. Frankenstein by Mary Shelley and Dracula by Bram Stoker. Both are pretty dark, pretty intense and psychological. And I'm not going to talk about the Universal Pictures dark universe. No. The beginning of The Invisible Man feels almost like a cliche. It seems like something that we've seen many times, but I'm sure in 1897 it didn't feel so cliche. But it kind of feels like an old movie in a way. Griffin, the Invisible Man, we don't know who he is yet. He's just known as the Stranger. And throughout the book, he will be known as the Stranger, off and on. He arrives in the middle of a snowstorm early in the day, and although the innkeeper is suspicious of him, she will not turn down his money that he throws on the table. And his head is covered with bandages, he's wearing sunglasses and a hat, and he's got hair sort of sticking out through the bandages here and there. He's wearing gloves. Shortly after that, the clock jobber arrives to fix the clock, and the Invisible Man, Griffin, is warming himself by the fire, and Mrs. Hall, the innkeeper, she goes to wake him up and tell him that, is it okay if this guy comes and fixes the clock? And he has fallen asleep, and his bandages have come off around his mouth. Everything was ruddy, shadowy, and indistinct to her, the more so since she had just been lighting the bar lamp, and her eyes were dazzled. But for a second it seemed to her that the man she looked at had an enormous mouth wide open, a vast and incredible mouth that swallowed the whole lower portion of his face. It was the sensation of a moment, the white-bound head, the monstrous goggle eyes, and this huge yawn below it. Then he started up in his chair, and put up his hand. And then she asks him if the clock jobber can come in and fix the clock. And it's just, there's a lot of really weird, kind of funny moments. I took this to be more silly than horror, but I suppose you could say it's kind of a horrific moment, because Mrs. Hall, the innkeeper, is quite startled by what she perceives as this, gaping mouth that's sort of disconnected from its skull. And then the clock jobber himself, Henfrey, he fixes the clock. He's kind of freaked out. He gets out of there, and he finds Mr. Hall, the innkeeper. Mrs. Hall and Mr. Hall run the Coach and Horses, which is the inn. He finds Mr. Hall coming home after stopping a bit in Ciderbridge or Sidderbridge. I'm not sure how to pronounce that. And I love that slang. He could tell that he had been stopping a bit in Ciderbridge because of the way he was driving. And I think I'm going to use that from now on. Like, I was stopping a bit on the way home, or I got off the train and I stopped a bit before I went on to whatever I had to do. That's a good one. And Henfrey basically tells him, there's a guy in your inn who's probably an escaped convict because he covers his face and there's something suspicious about him and blah, blah, blah. At the beginning of chapter 3, there's this great sentence that begins the chapter where it says, "Thus it was on the 9th day of February, at the beginning of the thaw, this singular person fell out of infinity into Iping village." H.G. Wells has such a way with words. Fell out of infinity. I mean, it's just perfect. In this kind of language, you can kind of tell it's not clear who the narrator is. It's not necessarily an omniscient narrator, but it doesn't seem to be just one person. It's almost like a collective report, like a police report, or like a maybe not news report, but like a testimony or something like that. All the afternoon he worked with the door locked, and, as Mrs. Hall testifies, for the most part in silence. So that's kind of interesting, as Mrs. Hall testifies. Chapter 8. The 8th chapter is exceedingly brief and relates that Gibbons, the amateur naturalist of the district, while lying out on the spacious open downs without a soul within a couple miles of him, as he thought, almost dozing, heard close to him the sound as of a man coughing, sneezing, and then swearing savagely to himself, and looking, beheld nothing. Maybe that's because The Invisible Man was published over the course of a few weeks in Pearson's Weekly magazine. It came out the same year. That was 1897. It was serialized, and then it came out as a book later in the year. But H.G. Wells had made some small changes, and also he added the epilogue to the book version. The first half of the book is framed as a mystery. The locals are trying to make sense of the appearance and the behavior of this strange man. He's covered in bandages and wearing sunglasses. He never uncovers himself even when he's eating. The practitioner, Mr. Cuss, not doctor for some reason, I'm not sure why, but anyway, Mr. Cuss, the practitioner, sees the empty sleeve of his shirt and he gets frightened, even more so when the invisible finger and thumb pinch his nose. No one knows what incredible rumors or gossip to even believe. And then comes the central revelation that the Invisible Man is breaking into people's houses in order to keep paying his innkeeper. After that, it becomes an action-packed chase, cat and invisible mouse, in which Griffin spirals into madness and the monster must attempt to escape as the authorities are hunting him. From then on, the story moves quickly, maintaining a sense of urgency that keeps you turning pages. I actually thought that this was one of the more readable classics, because the language is fairly simple. I'll read you a little bit from here. This chapter's called The Furniture That Went Mad. I mean, that right there kind of tells you, there's a bit of comedy in the madness. And at the beginning of this chapter, actually, it talks about the innkeepers, and they go down into the cellar, and specifically to water down their beer that they're serving in the bar, in the inn. And, there's all these little elements in there that make it kind of silly and comical. The quote is, "Their business there was of a private nature, and had something to do with the specific gravity of their beer." The uneducated townfolk are also played for laughs. I think of Mrs. Cuss and Mrs. Sackbutt playing with the Sunday school children. The names are just great. There's a line here in chapter 7. The stranger stood looking more like an angry diving helmet than ever. Because, of course, he's covered with bandages. In the same chapter, after everyone gets terrified of the Invisible Man, people down in the village heard shouts and shrieks, and looking up the street, saw the coach and horses. The coach and horses is the inn that I was just mentioning. The innkeepers water down their beer. People looking up the street saw the coach and horses violently firing out its humanity. I love that so much. People down the village heard shouts and shrieks, and looking up the street, they saw the coach and horses violently firing out its humanity. As everyone is tearing out of the building. The vicar, do you say vicar, the priest, he's obsessed with money. He doesn't move until, if he hears his hidden stash of coins rattling, then he is prompted to act. But other than that, he never talks about God. He never talks about morality. He's just concerned with wealth. And, if somebody comes to visit him, he serves them cheap sherry. Where did Wells get the idea for the Invisible Man? Well, it may have come from Plato's Republic. In Book 2 of the Republic, Glaucon argues with Socrates that men practice justice only out of fear of punishment. Without fear, they would steal, rape, and murder. He tells the story of Gyges, whose legendary ancestor, a poor shepherd, once found a magic ring inside a cave. Gyges gets his ring. He immediately goes to the royal palace. He rapes the queen. He kills the king. He takes over and becomes the new king. And that legend inspired many stories. Certainly J.R.R. Tolkien, who wrote The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, but perhaps H.G. Wells as well. It seems like he's taking that idea of injustice and, what would you do if you were invisible? Would you be a morally correct human being, or would you just take advantage of the situation? And he kind of runs with it. No man would keep his hands off of what was not his own when he could safely take what he liked out of the market, or go into houses and lie with anyone at his pleasure, or kill or release from prison whom he would, and in all respects he would be as a god among men. And he says that we can take this as proof that a man is just, not willingly or because he thinks that justice is any good to him individually, but out of necessity. For wherever one thinks that he can safely be unjust, there he is unjust. For all men believe in their hearts that injustice is far more profitable to the individual than justice, and he who argues, as I have been supposing, will say that they are right. If you could imagine anyone obtaining this power of becoming invisible, and never doing any wrong, or touching what was another's, he would be thought by the lookers-on to be a most wretched idiot, although they would praise him to one another's faces, and keep up appearances with one another, from a fear that they too might suffer injustice. Wells probably wanted to explore the corruption of power. Griffin's invisibility grants him superiority, almost invincibility, if you will. Wells actually kind of puts in there some ethical dilemmas, scientific progress and the nature of responsibility for this technology that we invent and we may not be able to control, which is still pretty timely. Although there's no magic ring in The Invisible Man, there is that kind of pseudoscience of, Griffin is studying light refraction and optics. And I've heard a lot of people go on about how kind of ridiculous it is that this could never happen, this is pseudoscience. But you know what? I think it's fine because the story, it's just suspend your disbelief and, go with it. I mean, I read a lot of comic books. It's nothing that I haven't seen before in that respect. It's just the inciting incident to get you into the story. It has nothing to do with real science whatsoever. It's a thought experiment. It's a morality play. It's good proto science fiction. And to go along with the comic booky thing, I love the fact that the Invisible Man teams up with that guy Thomas Marvel. They call him Mr. Marvel, and that made it all the more kind of comic booky for me. Mr. Marvel, of course, not even being amazing or marvelous, but he's actually a complete idiot. But they have some good times together. You must picture Mr. Thomas Marvel as a person of copious, flexible visage, a nose of cylindrical protrusion, a liquorish, ample, fluctuating mouth, and a beard of bristling eccentricity. His figure inclined to embonpoint. His short limbs accentuated this inclination. He wore a furry silk hat, and the frequent substitution of twine and shoelaces for buttons, at apparently critical points of his costume, marked a man essentially bachelor. I mean, you can learn some new vocabulary from that, like embonpoint. And also you can really see, he's got this crazy beard, he doesn't have buttons, so he's got twine and shoelaces, interlaced in his jacket or his shirt. Probably kind of an itinerant wanderer. Just fantastic descriptions, fantastic sentences. Some things I didn't like about the book: I find the dialogue to be kind of a slog at times, even though it's wacky, it's comical, but it's sometimes it reminded me a little bit of the book Trainspotting, where it's like I didn't really understand what they were saying unless I read it out loud, and then I could kind of guess what it was, because Trainspotting is fairly recently, but it's old English, and it's weird slang, and he writes the words phonetically sometimes, and so you're not really sure. Women is spelled like W-I-M or something like that, and it's like, what? And then but you read it out loud, and then you're kind of like, oh, okay, I get it now. What I loved about it is the atmosphere. I loved Griffin as the mad scientist, just mentally unraveling as his physical body unravels. I love the atmosphere. I love the dumb townsfolk who are all just a bunch of country bumpkins, and they're all terrified of everything that they don't understand. And he's able to sort of manipulate them, and the weird comedic elements that come in. Just the general weirdness of the story. It's incredibly memorable. And it never gets bogged down in too much like purple prose or too much description of anything. I find old novels to be sometimes kind of a slog to get through, but this one just flies along. It really is so readable. It's so rereadable. And the ending sequence, I'm not going to spoil it, but the ending sequence where, everyone is hunting for the Invisible Man is really, I wouldn't say it's necessarily heart-pounding, but it's page-turning. So that was also really exciting. So, back to my original question. Is it possible to betray yourself? Throughout this story, we see Griffin struggle. He's constantly making bad decisions. He's constantly yelling at people when he could be more polite, and he might actually get what he wants. Yes, the townsfolk are suspicious of outsiders, but Griffin himself makes them more suspicious by acting very cagey, and frankly, he's a bastard. He steals, he lies, he burns people's houses down. He's a horrible, horrible bastard. And worst of all, he has like an unchecked ego, and he wants to take over the world. So not only do we see that no one trusts him and he doesn't trust others, but it actually shows that maybe he can't even trust himself. Is this a great book? Yeah, it's pretty good. I think it's a classic for a reason. Does it need to be adapted for children? Maybe. I guess if you take out some of the horrible acts of violence, although, as you can see in this illustration, they keep the bloodstains in there. It's great. It's a quick read. It's really fun. It's proto science fiction. It's a proto supervillain. It's a damaged morality tale with all kinds of ethical implications, and it's a lot of fun. You can read it in an afternoon. And also the 1933 film is a wonderful classic monster movie.
Even the moon's frightened of me, frightened to death. The whole world's frightened to death.
I highly recommend The Invisible Man. You can find it anywhere. I think you can find it for free online because it's beyond copyright. So I think you can read it online. You can find nice editions of H.G. Wells' classic novels like this one. Don't get it confused with Invisible Man, without the, by Ralph Ellison. This is also an amazing novel, but it's completely different. And actually, I actually read Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man when I was in high school because I thought that it was the H.G. Wells Invisible Man that I had heard of, and I didn't know who the author was. And so I read this, and I was like, that book was amazing. But it didn't really have like an actual invisible guy. It was more like, he's the metaphor. He's invisible, or he's hiding. He's a hiding man. So, I'd also recommend Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man. That's all I've got. Thank you kindly. See you again.
You're crazy to know who I am, aren't you? All right, I'll show you. There's a souvenir for you. And one for you. I'll show you who I am and what I am.
Look, he's all eaten away.
Huh? How do you like that, eh?